Hey guys, my name is Cicabeot1. Halloween as a concept is something I've never really understood or cared about all that much, but I have to give it credit, because it gave me the perfect opportunity to talk about my favorite band of all time. Silversun pickups are an act I hold near and dear. Their shoegaze style has stuck with me for many years, and they've inspired me a lot in my endeavors to play guitar and bass. One of my early music-related videos on the channel was a list of my favorite songs from the band, and I even saw them live back in 2021, something that would have been very high on my bucket list prior if I had to make one. I am intimately familiar with the band's first 4 studio albums: Carnivorous, Swoon, Neck of the Woods, and Better Nature. I do also like their later albums Widow's Weeds and Physical Thrills, but the first 4 albums defined my later high school and college years in a way I wouldn't trade for the world. Swoon in particular is a strong contender for my favorite album of all time. But to celebrate the Halloween season, I wanted to zero in on what I think is the perfect Halloween album: Neck of the Woods. Released in May of 2012, Neck of the Woods was a bit of an experimental release. An increased focus on synthesizers, many more macabre lyrical themes. At the time, I had just recently gotten into the band due to their music being featured in Guitar Hero and Rock Band, inspiring me to look into the 2 studio albums they had at the time and falling in love with them. And as such, I purchased Neck of the Woods on iTunes day 1, and at first it felt like a bit of a black sheep. The emphasis on more slow burn songs and the off-putting atmosphere of many tracks did make this, in my opinion, a little harder to get into compared to Carnivous' more whimsical shoegaze feel or Swoon's intimidating grand quest motif. Neck of the Woods is a straight-up horror album. If the cover showcasing a house in creepy lighting and the track listing containing a song called Bloody Mary didn't tip you off to that, and horror isn't something I'm all that into, there's very few horror movies I'd consider watching, and I can play a few Resident Evil and Silent Hill games, but that's about it. So it makes sense that it took a little bit for me to really get this album. I used to consider it my least favorite SSPU record, but over time, I've grown to appreciate it more and more, and it now sits in second place, only behind Swoon. For a while, it's been sort of a tradition for me that I listen to this album sometime around Halloween for these reasons, and this year, I wanted to share in that experience. What better way to celebrate a holiday that's outside of your comfort zone than by indulging in media that falls squarely within that comfort zone? Let's get started. The album starts with Skin Graph, a very slow burn song, but one I think is incredibly effective, not just in creating an engaging atmosphere, but in setting the tone for the rest of the album. Also, it continues the Pickups tradition of stellar opening tracks. Pakal had Kissing Families, which was also the only song they played from that EP when I saw them live. Carnivorous had Melatonin, Swoon had There's No Secrets This Year, and Better Nature would go on to have Cradle. This is one of my favorite songs on the album. The reverbed guitars have a soothing, inviting tone that lulls you into a false sense of security, a tone that goes on for quite a while. And then the synths come in and shift the tone completely. From this moment forward, the song is as unsettling as they come. This simple, stuttered, fuzzed-out 2-note riff makes me feel like I'm dissociating, and there's no turning back. It's a sort of introduction to the new style this album embodies. The pretty guitars and synths haven't exactly left us, but there's far more emphasis on electronic nightmares. It's like Panic Switch on steroids. For the next 58 minutes, you're in a world concocted by keyboardist Joe Lester, and you better love it. Though, of course, the song starts to come a bit more into its own with the introduction of the drums. A nice, manic, quick beat that's well within Chris Guanlau's wheelhouse, which leads nicely into the song's only verse. Yeah, odd thing about this song, it's 6 minutes long, but only has one extended verse. And it may be a cliche, but I truly mean it when I say this. no second is wasted here. The verse has a familiar dreamy feel with the reverb of the guitars, not quite playing the song's full hand yet, but still giving some bizarre imagery in the lyrics. These are vague but creepy musings about being reborn in a new body, making Brian Aubert sound like a bit of a serial killer. It's really creepy, and I'll admit, half the time, I don't really understand Silversun Pickup's lyrics. Oftentimes the lyrics don't really seem to be about anything in particular, and they're not really going to be a major focus of this review. Mostly the lyrics are the way they are to set a mood for a particular song, and here the mood is excellent. It sounds calming, but still gives you the impression that something isn't right, further emphasized by the pre-chorus. Things slow back down again for just a brief moment before ramping up and exploding for the real chorus. It takes nearly 3 minutes to get to this chorus, but the journey to get to it is well worth it. It takes its time to build anticipation for something big like good horror should, creating a specific atmosphere to get lost in before releasing a satisfying payoff. And just when you think you're safe, it does it again. The bridge is a big reset, presenting an even calmer atmosphere with less emphasis on drums. Even the lyrics feel softer, almost comforting, with a tinge of creepiness to rebuild anticipation. Even the passage between the pre-chorus and chorus is longer than before, and it feels like it's slowing down ever so slightly. And then the chorus plays, and it's even more intense than before. This is one of my favorite opening tracks to any album. It makes its theme immediately known and gives off one of the best executions of its theme right off the bat. Before the album had released, I had not heard its lead-off single Bloody Mary yet, so I essentially went into this blind at the time. And yet, even before the album fully clicked for me, I knew this song was something special. It's weird and disturbing and intriguing. Basically all the things I would come to love about the album in the coming years. And as much as I do love this one song, we do kind of have to move on with the rest of the record. We have 10 tracks to go after all. Second on the album is Make Believe, and in contrast with the last song, which took its time to build anticipation, this track is a little more forward with its attitude, immediately starting with a creepy, frantic guitar riff and a thwacking drum pattern. And it makes sense to put a song like this second on the album. By now, you're already accustomed to how demented this record is going to sound, so they don't have to make every song a slow burn. It still builds in anticipation, but not in a way that gives any illusion of calm. The whole track from start to end is unnerving. Here, Brian takes on the role of a tyrant king, with the most striking line, outside of the album title drop, being this in the third verse. I think this is the most outwardly violent Silversun Pickup's lyrics had gotten up to that point. And it still might be the most violent they've been to this day, maybe only being challenged by Freakazoid from Widow's Weeds. But most of all, I like how the chorus gets recontextualized by the way it's executed. At first, it's quiet and creepy and sung in a lower octave. I can never show you what you gave to me. But the second time, it's more intense with greater prominence on drums. I can never show you what you gave to me. Brian Aubert sings in a forceful, shouty voice and belts out the last few lines, leading right into the guitar solo. Yeah, it's just some of the basic chords played with more distortion. It's basically harsh noise, but it hits me just right. Again, this is a different kind of tension from the first song, more outwardly violent than trying to slink under your skin. If Skin Graft was a Hitchcock movie, this is more Saw. Blunt and jagged and a total spectacle. A little off-putting, but still up my alley. But subtlety hasn't all gone out the window, thankfully. Just listen to this next track. Bloody Mary Nerve Endings was the first single released for this album, and it has always been a favorite of mine. Nowadays, I think the pickups maybe play it a little too safe for their lead single choices, like with It Doesn't Matter Why for Widow's Weeds or Scared Together for Physical Thrills, but for Neck of the Woods, they really put their best foot forward, because while this does have a little more pop polish compared to many other songs on the record, still making it the obvious single, its sense of atmosphere is still superb. It is nearly as good as Skin Graft was in building quiet tension and fear. Heck, the song is named after an urban legend that's inspired plenty of horror movies in its day. But moreover, this song is absolutely beautiful. That intro with the twinkling synths you can only really describe as mesmerizing. Yeah, it's also full of ghostly wails and chants, but there is plenty of beauty to be found in the creepy and unsettling. It is a long, slow burn intro, but it is so enveloping and builds anticipation to a complete reset of a verse. Yeah, there's a bit of a curveball at the start of the verse, with only vocals and gentle guitar strings there to greet us, which I do love, but the rest of the verse picks up with some familiar, creepy shoegaze, until this monster of a chorus drops. 2.5 minutes into the song, and yet it still feels earned. And it's the chorus itself that's a payoff for once, with strong, crunchy guitars and some really gorgeous backing vocals from bassist Nikki Monginger. I really love her voice. She's often in a similar register as Brian, but softer and a little more inviting. She's even taken some lead vocal presence on songs like Circadian Rhythm from Better Nature or Alone on a Hill from Physical Thrills, though here she pretty much only provides harmonies, but I think she's best used for that here, and in another track later on. Her pitches give the chorus more of a ghostly presence, echoing mantras about being in a fight-or-flight response. Gives you chills right in the spine. I think when they played this song live a couple of years ago, it was actually her vocal line I was mostly following along with on the chorus. So simple yet so effective, especially in a smaller venue like First Avenue. And unlike with Skin Graft, when the song's resetting itself to build up to the second chorus, it doesn't get quiet again. In fact, it's almost eager to get back to that beast. Maybe you could call this rushing it, but with more of a glitzy vibe than before, it's earned its right to get right back into the nitty-gritty. Makes it hit just as hard and deliver on the album's centerpiece, as it were. An absolute adrenaline rush, and to me, one of the best songs in the Pickups catalog. If you only need one song from this record, make it this one. It's not quite my favorite song on the album, we'll get to that in a few, but it might be the most essential that we've talked about yet. They were right to make this a single. Track 4 on this thing is called Busy Bees, something to get more in the vein of make-believe, but in a different direction. So we're kind of switching back and forth between glitzy slow burns and songs that start off a little more forceful. I even think I heard this song on the radio once, which is weird because it wasn't a single, but it's not like I'm complaining. This does what a lot of songs on the album like to do, and it just simmers a bit. The main riff is eerie and rhythmic, but builds to something greater in the chorus, primarily a series of distorted chords and a chugging bass line. and it's all just a bit more atmospheric than make-believe. More moments of calm with more rugged production, only really coming up in parts of the chorus. Still suitably creepy with a good payoff, and doesn't feel nearly as long as it is. But after about a third of the album, I think it's time to switch things up a bit so that things don't get too samey. And thankfully, I think the next track does just that. Here We Are, Chancer is the quietest song on the whole album. No massive explosions like the previous songs, just a tender, anxiety-ridden piece to bridge us into possibly the most chaotic song on the whole record coming up next.
Here we are, underneath.
This used to be my least favorite track on the album, and I even thought it was kinda boring, but it has grown on me over the years. It's still not something I'm likely to listen to outside of the album, but I can appreciate its place here anyway. It's one of the spots where the electronic elements are at their most prominent, particularly with the focus on electronic drums. Well, more of an obvious focus at least. Which isn't a problem at all. I think it fits the subtle, eerie vibe really well, and Chris Guanlau's driving drum style is still very apparent, keeping this energetic despite the slow pace. But this is also one of the places on the record where the bass especially shines, and it kinda has to, considering the guitars are mostly echoed and reverbed sustains. If anything, I think the bass should have been mixed a bit higher because of this, but it's still enough for this to make you feel weightless while listening to it. It isn't mind-blowing, but this borderline ambient take on what the album's given us so far is pretty well suited for the halfway mark of the record. After some stressful songs, it's good to have something to let you down easy and reset your expectations for the rest of the project. And in some ways, it's reminiscent of 3 Seed from Carnivorous, even if it's not nearly as beautiful. And even though this is a quiet song from beginning to end, that doesn't mean it goes nowhere. Towards the end, the instruments do get more aggressive, the vocals get more desperate. It's not quite a true explosion or even a change in tempo, but it is an appropriately subtle payoff for a slow, lengthy song. And it is that progression that's made me respect it more in recent years. How it's more somber than some of the other songs here, but still captivating in its own way. It's oddly pretty in a ghostly fashion. Yeah, this album sure does love feeling like a ghost, doesn't it? Or I guess you could call them spirits, like this next song does. Mean Spirits is my favorite song on the album, the one that kept me coming back over and over again at first, and still a shining example of Silversun Pickup's energy, their song structure, their creativity, their adaptability. Back in 2017, I named this as my second favorite song from the band overall, only behind Growing Old is Getting Old from Swoon, and I still stand by that opinion today. Cause while the previous tracks here were creepy shoegaze tunes, this is a full-on hard rock song. There's still some faintly creepy sounds here, but mostly we've got lots of energy, a fast pace, and strong, crunchy guitar licks. They are exactly up my alley and get my blood pumping every time. But while it is different from most of the rest of the album, it's not out of place. There's still the same bleak tone in the writing as before, there's still plenty of ominous moaning from Brian that keeps up the mood, but most importantly, there's that 3-second intro that sounds like a ghostly wail. This album is full of songs that take their time to get to their greatest impact, but this one's ready to go immediately. That frantic drum pattern in particular really is a marvel. Possibly Chris Guanlau's best moment on the record, and he already shines brightly on multiple songs. It doesn't need the slow moments of anticipation, just a punchy, memorable intro and a groovy main melody that carries through nearly the whole song, with blasts of distortion when it's appropriate. But my favorite part of the song, intro aside, would have to be the bridge. For just a brief and sudden moment, everything becomes atmospheric. The drums stop, the synths and bass plug along as if in the distance, the guitars strum a bit, making you feel weightless right before everything crashes back into place. It's a good break from the action in a song that's otherwise constantly moving, and we get a similar moment later on when we get a reprise of the intro, followed by silence. Always keeps you on your toes. The previous songs were there to unsettle you, this one's there to let out some aggression, and it is wonderful. This was not released as a single, but I really wish it was. It may be very different from the rest of the album, but it's in a good way that I think rock radio could have used at the time. But of course, I'm happy to have this song in any capacity really. It is so special to me. Unfortunately, after easily my favorite song on the record, we come to one that's in contention for my least favorite. Track 7 is called Simmer, and that is definitely an appropriate title for this because that is what it does. It simmers with long builds. Even though I think this is one of the lesser songs here, I do still like it, and I wouldn't skip it or anything, but I don't think it does anything as unique or special as some of the other songs on the album, aside from maybe the prominence of the bass. I will never object to Nikki Monginger having more of an impact on these songs. She deserves it. I think my issue is more with the excess of it all. This follows one of the most intense songs on the album, and almost seems to be trying to one-up it. More staticky production, more intense payoffs in the choruses. Good idea on paper, but a bit overwhelming in practice. However, I will give credit for still maintaining the tense atmosphere of much of the rest of the album, especially with the ascending ghostly vocals that cap off every line in the chorus. But my favorite moment comes in the outro. Everything's winding down, and we get a repeated mantra of that's where it starts and where it ends. That's where it starts. Genuinely chilling and satisfying, and in some ways, it does make up for some of the parts I wasn't as big on. But even still, I can't really complain that much, because the next track goes on to iron out some of the issues that I had with this. The Pit was the second single released for this album. Not what I would have picked myself, but it definitely has its moments, and with its slow build and ramped up chorus, I do think it has a lot in common with Simmer, which is probably why they're right next to each other. But this has more of a sense of restraint. The verses have less fuzz in the production, opting for lower, more techno-like synths that keep more of a pulsing rhythm than Simmer's more ambient approach. Love the way it meshes with the twinkling guitar melodies too. This is another track that leans more on the electronic side of things, and it's a good one. I see this as less overtly spooky, just invoking imageries of a misty cemetery, implying the pit could even be a grave hole. Or at least it could be if it wasn't actually a reference to a comic book series. I went my whole life without knowing this, but the lyrics to this were inspired by Black Hole, about a group of teens who fall victim to mutations caused by a sexually transmitted disease. I'm not familiar with it, but it seems quite dark and therefore a good fit for this album, and it makes me wonder what other inspirations other songs on this record might have that Genius doesn't know about. But to bring our focus back to the song, even though it's not as overtly scary as some other tracks, it is still appropriately tense, especially the chorus and bridge. Brian's wailing of "no one cares" just feels so transcendent. This makes sense why it was a single, as it's one of the more approachable songs on the album, and for its nerdy deep cut inspiration, there's better, but still plenty to enjoy. Besides, I prefer the next single just a little bit more. Dots and Dashes Enough Already was the last single released for the album, and it is a good one. It's one of the grooviest songs on the album, for one. Right out the gate, you have this simple walking bass pattern, but it is effective. And I like the way the guitars sort of pluck along and ride that groove. I like the whoos of the backing vocals following the synths. But the real magic of this song starts at the pre-chorus. The chants of "I'm already bored," "I'm already wise," etc. make up one of the best moments on the album. So hypnotically beautiful and mysterious. This section just encapsulates the whimsy I feel listening to this album on whole. A different kind of whimsy from that of Carnivus. Brian and Nicky's vocals blend especially well here. It sounds pleasant yet tense. And I especially grew to appreciate the pre-chorus when I heard it live. Like, this chant almost feels like it was made to be experienced live. It is immaculate. And the chorus that follows it is of course really good too, but it is more aggressive thanks to the snare drums playing more frequently and with the more shouty vocals. It's kinda spooky. And especially following that up with yet another ambient bridge, yeah, it gives me tingles. Not the first time this album plays this sort of trick. It's pretty similar to Skin Graph, only it's quicker to really build back up to the pre-chorus. Joe Lester's synths get steadily more punchy as Brian's voice floats through a misty air, and it is wonderful. The fear on display here isn't as intense as some of the earlier songs, but still, this is a beautiful shoegaze song, like this band has always made them. Also, lesbians in the music video. Love to see it. But the previous three tracks have all been pretty similar in their vibes to me, so I think it's time to switch it up for the penultimate track. Gunshi Sunshine is another one of the softer tracks on the album, though more upbeat and less of an electronic fever dream than Here We Are, and this is one I've always loved. It's much more chill than much of the rest of the album, but still has that ambient edge you come to expect. And for album sequencing, I think it was a good idea to use this to reset expectations, to calm things down into the stretch to the final song, because that one is a doozy. But here, it's mostly gentle guitars and drums with the occasional twinkling synths. It's really pretty in a bit of a different way from the rest of the album, but just because it's a quieter song doesn't mean it can't still ramp up to the chorus. Yeah, this is a satisfying hook, especially with that stinger of a riff. Now that's some hard rock swagger. That riff is really the main reason this lands as one of my favorite songs on the album. It's a shallow reason, I know, but I'm not gonna apologize. Plus, in the second chorus, we get these backing vocals that interrupt the lead melody. It's kinda trippy, but really cool, and appropriate considering how it leads into the bridge, and one of the trippiest moments on the album. The synths pretty much completely take over for a few bars, making everything feel weightless with these chirping sustains. So relaxing. More proof that this is Joe Lester's world and we're just living in it. And it makes the return of the main riffs all the more satisfying. Even though this is most effective after going through the entire album, I've still gone to it on its own, and it still hits hard, and that's gotta be the mark of a good deep cut. Simple, but done really well. And now that we're sufficiently brought back down to earth, it's time to get the blood boiling one last time. The album ends with a song appropriately titled Out of Breath. Now, up until this point, the pickups went out with bombastic finales. Carnivis had Common Reactor, and Swoon had Surrounded or Spiraling, and Out of Breath is really no exception. However, I think this one does a better job at managing its excess than those other two songs. Not to the point where this is top tier for me, but enough to make it a more satisfying final act. Immediately, this track smacks you with a quiet tremolo guitar lick, one that symbolizes rising tensions and a lack of control. Very neck of the woods. Now ain't that a good line to summarize this record? I like how this one doesn't quite go full blast on the first chorus, having minimal instrumental accompaniment to let the tension soak in just a bit longer. And then, as the next verse starts, the drums come back in full force, and the guitar riff gets fleshed out a little more. It's some extra contrast that really makes the second chorus pop more than before, not to mention the guitar solo that plays, one of the few on the record, and one that matches the frantic rhythm set by the tremolo. This isn't what I'd call the scariest song on the project, but it is one of the most desperate, more forceful and anguished after a series of tracks that relied heavily on atmosphere. You hear it, and you feel jolted and hyper-aware of your surroundings. So like a jump scare. No, I'm not gonna jump scare you, I hate those things too. It makes sense that the final track on this experience is something to heighten your senses. It is a great closer. Probably my favorite moment here is when all the instruments drop out except the guitar and vocals, making way for one last explosion before the end. There are a couple problems here. The production peaks a bit like on Simmer, and the bridge is a bit weak and aimless, but other than that, this sticks the landing. The journey is over, you're out of the woods. You're safe now. At least until the sequel. Which arguably the pickups did make with their next album, Better Nature, but for now, it's time to let the credits roll, so to speak, and reflect on what we've just heard. Though this album felt like an odd duck to me at the time, over the years, I grew to really love and appreciate its concept. Comparing this to a horror movie is admittedly my own doing, even if Brian Aubert did take some writing influence from some disturbing media, but I do think the pieces are there. Some songs on their previous record, Swoon, were pretty tense and disturbing in their own right, but this one increases that mood at least tenfold. There's less relief from the drama here, and every track on here could be considered at least reasonably unsettling. There is more of a focus on Joe Lester's keyboards and programming than arguably ever before, and that's something they would continue to experiment with in future records. And here, I think those experiments mostly paid off. A lot of these songs mean a lot to me, and I still get lost in them whenever I hear them, to the point I can't believe this record is already 11 years old. And even if it was just the singles, it was a magical experience hearing songs from this record performed live almost 2 years ago. This still isn't perfect, and I'd still consider it a bit of an oddball record that's not for everyone, but even as someone who's typically very selective with the horror media she takes in, this really speaks to me. And I can bet it's still gonna be on my rotation each and every Halloween season. I'm Cicabeot1, this is probably as spooky as I'm ever gonna get on this channel, and take care.